Eleanor smoothed her best tablecloth for the third time, her weathered hands trembling slightly with excitement. At 68, she rarely had reason to use the good china anymore, but tonight was special. Tonight, she would finally share news that would make her children proud. The dining room of her modest two-bedroom home gleamed under the soft chandelier light. She'd spent hours preparing Michael's favorite pot roast, Sarah's beloved garlic mashed potatoes, and David's preferred green bean casserole. Every dish was a labor of love, just like the countless meals she'd made during their childhood when money was tight and love had to stretch further than the grocery budget. The presidential invitation lay carefully tucked in her sweater pocket, the official seal still making her heart flutter. After all these years of silence, of keeping secrets to protect them, she could finally tell them the truth about who she really was. Michael arrived first, his black BMW gleaming in the driveway. At 42, her eldest son commanded respect in Manhattan's most prestigious law firm, his tailored suit costing more than Eleanor's monthly Social Security check. He barely glanced up from his phone as he kissed her cheek. "Mom, I can only stay an hour. I have a conference call with Tokyo at 9. Sarah swept in next, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood floors Eleanor had polished that morning. At 39, she boasted 2 million Instagram followers who hung on her every word about luxury lifestyle and success. Her perfectly contoured face barely concealed her impatience. "Mother, you know I'm doing a live stream at 8, right? My audience expects consistency." David, the youngest at 37, arrived in his Tesla, already looking at his Apple Watch. His tech company had just gone public, making him worth more than Eleanor could comprehend. He hugged her absently, his mind clearly elsewhere. "Hey Mom, thanks for dinner, but I really can't stay long. Big presentation tomorrow." As they sat around the table, Eleanor's excitement bubbled over. She reached into her pocket, feeling the crisp edges of the invitation that would change everything. "I have wonderful news to share," she began, her voice warm with anticipation. "I've been invited to Mom." "Seriously," Michael interrupted, not looking up from his phone. "Can we just eat? Some of us have real responsibilities." Eleanor's smile faltered, but she pressed on. "It's from the White House. The president wants to." Sarah burst into laughter, the sound sharp and cruel. "Oh my God, Mom, did you fall for one of those scam letters again? You're so gullible." "It's not a scam, sweetheart. I'm being honored for what?" David's voice dripped with condescension. "Mom, you worked in some boring office job your whole life. What could you possibly be honored for?" The words hit Eleanor like physical blows. She watched her children exchange knowing glances, their expressions a mixture of embarrassment and pity. "Honestly, Mother," Sarah said, posting a photo of her plate to Instagram, "these delusions of grandeur are getting worse. It's actually embarrassing. You're nobody special." "Mom," Michael added matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather, "just accept it. There's nothing wrong with being ordinary." Eleanor's hand released the invitation, letting it flutter to the floor unnoticed. The room fell silent except for the ticking of her grandmother's clock and the soft pings of her children's phones. One by one, they made their excuses and left, their luxury cars disappearing into the night like their respect for her had years ago. Eleanor stood alone in her kitchen, mechanically clearing plates, still full of the food she'd made with such hope. The presidential invitation lay crumpled on the floor where it had fallen, forgotten and dismissed like the woman who'd received it. But as the last dish was washed and put away, Eleanor picked up that letter. Something shifted in her tired eyes, a spark of determination replacing the tears. Eleanor sank into her worn armchair, the presidential invitation still clutched in her trembling hands, the silence of her empty house pressed against her like a physical weight, broken only by the memories that came flooding back unbidden. She closed her eyes and was suddenly 28 again, standing in the principal's office of St. Augustine's Preparatory Academy. Michael, barely 6 years old, had just been accepted to the most prestigious elementary school in the city. The tuition was astronomical, more than she made in 6 months at her cover job as a filing clerk. "We can arrange a payment plan," the administrator had said with barely concealed skepticism, eyeing Eleanor's second-hand dress and scuffed shoes. That night, Eleanor had worked her third job cleaning office buildings until dawn, her hands raw from industrial cleaners, her back aching from hours bent over desks and floors. She'd hidden her real work so completely that even she sometimes forgot who she really was during those endless, exhausting nights. The memory shifted to Michael's 8th birthday. She'd saved for months to buy him the bicycle he desperately wanted, the same model all his classmates rode. When she'd presented it to him, wrapped in newspaper because she couldn't afford proper gift wrap. His face had fallen. "It's not the right color, Mom. And why didn't you use real wrapping paper? What if my friends see?" Even then, at 8 years old, he'd been ashamed of her. Eleanor remembered the day she'd sold her mother's pearl necklace, the only valuable thing she owned, passed down through 3 generations of women who'd worn it on their wedding days. Sarah needed her senior class trip to Europe, and the other girls would notice if she was the only one who couldn't go. "You understand, don't you, Mom?" 17-year-old Sarah had said, not really asking. "My reputation at school depends on this. I can't be seen as poor." Eleanor had nodded, slipping the pearl necklace into her purse as she headed to the pawn shop. She'd never told Sarah what she'd sacrificed, just handed over the money with a smile and watched her daughter's face light up with selfish joy. The pattern had continued through David's childhood. Private tutors she couldn't afford, paid for with her mother's wedding ring. Elite summer camps funded by selling her father's war medals. Every sacrifice made in silence, every personal treasure traded for their opportunities. She remembered working for different jobs during David's senior year of high school, her real work at the agency, plus evening shifts at a diner, weekend house cleaning, and late-night data entry from home. She'd collapse into bed at 3 in the morning, only to wake at 6 to pack David's lunch and drive him to his expensive private school in her battered Honda. "Mom, could you drop me off around the corner?" he'd asked one morning, sliding down in his seat as they approached the school gates. "It's just, your car is kind of embarrassing." She'd watched him walk those extra 3 blocks rather than be seen with her. His mother, who worked herself to exhaustion to give him everything. The college years had been the worst. 3 children in elite universities simultaneously, each costing more per year than most people made. Eleanor had sold everything of value, her grandmother's china, her father's tools, even the engagement ring from their absent father who'd abandoned them when the children were small. She'd eaten peanut butter sandwiches for dinner so they could have steak in their dorm cafeterias. She'd worn the same 3 outfits for years so they could have designer clothes. She'd walked to work in snowstorms to save bus fare for their textbooks and spring break trips. And through it all, not one of them had ever asked how she managed it. Not one had wondered how a simple office worker could afford their privileged lives. They'd simply accepted it as their due, gradually becoming more embarrassed by her modest lifestyle, more dismissive of her sacrifices. At Michael's law school graduation, she'd overheard him talking to his classmates. "Oh, that's just my mom. She's nobody important. Basic office worker. You know, I don't really talk about my family much." The words had cut deeper than any blade. Eleanor opened her eyes, returning to the present moment. Slowly, she rose from her chair and walked to her bedroom closet. Hidden behind winter coats she rarely wore anymore was a dusty cardboard box she hadn't opened in years. It was time her children learned who their mother really was. Eleanor's fingers traced the edges of the dusty box as she lifted it from its hiding place behind forgotten winter coats. The cardboard had yellowed with age, but the memories it contained burned as bright as the day she'd earned them. She carried it to her kitchen table like a sacred relic, her heart hammering with 30 years of suppressed pride. The first item she pulled out was a photograph that would have stopped her children cold. There stood Eleanor, 20 years younger, wearing tactical gear in what looked like a Middle Eastern compound. Her face was lean and focused, holding an assault rifle with the casual expertise of someone who'd used it to save lives. Behind her, grateful hostages smiled through their tears. 12 oil executives she'd extracted from a terrorist stronghold in 1994. She'd told her children she was attending a work conference that week. They'd been annoyed she'd miss Michael's Little League game. Next came the commendation letter on CIA letterhead, signed by the director himself. Agent Eleanor Blackwood demonstrated extraordinary courage during Operation Silent Thunder, preventing what could have been a catastrophic international incident. Her quick thinking and decisive action saved an estimated 3,000 civilian lives in downtown Prague. Eleanor remembered that mission with crystal clarity. She'd been deep undercover as a hotel cleaning woman when she'd discovered the bomb plot. While other mothers were packing school lunches, she'd been defusing explosives in a Prague hotel basement, her hands steady as a surgeon's while sweat dripped into her eyes. The children thought she'd been visiting a sick aunt that week. Another photograph showed her shaking hands with 3 different presidents across 2 decades. In each image, she wore simple civilian clothes, but the respect in these powerful men's eyes was unmistakable. These weren't photo ops or campaign events. These were private moments. When the most powerful people in the world thanked her for keeping their citizens safe, a Purple Heart caught the light as she lifted it reverently. Afghanistan, 2002. She'd taken shrapnel while protecting an embassy evacuation, bleeding through her tactical vest but never leaving her post until every American citizen was safely airborne. The scar still ached on cold mornings, a reminder of the price she'd paid for freedom. David had been sick with flu that week. She'd told him she was working extra shifts at the office to pay for his medicine. The medals seemed endless as she laid them out. Bronze Star, Distinguished Intelligence Cross, CIA Director's Award for Exceptional Service. Each one represented missions that had tested every fiber of her being. Operations that had demanded she become someone else entirely to protect innocent lives. There were photographs of her in a dozen different identities. The Swiss banker who'd exposed an arms-dealing ring. The Russian translator who'd prevented a nuclear materials theft. The aid worker who'd rescued captured journalists from Somalia. In each image, she was unrecognizable, a master of disguise, who'd walked among the world's most dangerous people without them suspecting. The suburban mother beneath the facade. Eleanor pulled out a leather-bound journal, her own handwriting chronicling missions across 6 continents. Each entry was coded. But she remembered every detail. The night she'd stopped a chemical weapons sale in Budapest while Sarah thought she was attending a PTA conference. The week she'd prevented an assassination in Tokyo while the children believed she was visiting her sister. The month she'd infiltrated a human trafficking ring in Eastern Europe while they complained about her being gone for another boring work trip. For 30 years, she'd lived a double life more complex than any spy novel. By day, she was Eleanor Martinez, the quiet single mother who worked at what the children assumed was a mundane government filing job. By night, by weekend, by whatever time duty called, she was Agent Blackwood, one of the CIA's most decorated operatives, trusted with missions that lesser agents couldn't handle. She'd chosen the cover story of a simple office worker precisely because it was boring, enough that her children would never ask questions. They'd never wondered why she sometimes came home with mysterious injuries, why she spoke fragments of languages they didn't recognize in her sleep, why she could pick any lock or hotwire any car when necessary. The irony was devastating. While her children were embarrassed by what they saw as her ordinary life, she was secretly one of the most extraordinary women of her generation. While they dismissed her as a nobody, she was known in intelligence circles worldwide as the operative who never failed, who could adapt to any situation, who'd earned the respect of allies and enemies alike. The presidential invitation suddenly made perfect sense. After decades of classified service, her contributions were finally being recognized publicly. The Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor in America, would be placed around the neck of the woman her children called embarrassing. Eleanor looked at her reflection in the kitchen window, seeing not the modest grandmother her children scorned, but the decorated agent who'd served her country with distinction for 3 decades. Their cruelty tonight had done something unexpected. It had freed her from the burden of secrecy that had defined her life. It was time the world knew who Eleanor Martinez really was. The first phone call Eleanor made the next morning was to Director James Harrison, her former handler, who'd retired to a quiet life in Virginia. His voice cracked with emotion when he heard her name. Eleanor Blackwood, I wondered if I'd ever hear from you again after you went dark. His warm chuckle carried decades of shared memories. You know, there isn't a week that goes by that someone in the community doesn't mention the Prague operation, or the Budapest extraction. You're a living legend. I kept quiet to protect my children, Eleanor said, surprised by how good it felt to speak freely after years of careful omission. But I think it's time to step back into the light. Within days, invitations began pouring in. The veterans of foreign wars wanted her as their keynote speaker. The International Women in Intelligence Summit requested her presence as their guest of honor. Former colleagues reached out through secure channels, expressing amazement that the great Agent Blackwood had been living quietly among them all these years. Eleanor accepted them all. The first event was a small gathering at the CIA Memorial Wall, where she stood alongside other retired operatives who'd served with distinction. As she placed her hand on the marble wall honoring fallen agents, 3 of whom had died on missions she'd led, the weight of her hidden life began to lift from her shoulders. You saved my life in Sarajevo, whispered Patricia Chen, a former analyst who'd been trapped behind enemy lines. I never got to thank you properly. Similar stories emerged throughout the evening. The ambassador she'd extracted from a coup in Venezuela, the Marine whose unit she'd guided to safety in Iraq, the journalists she'd rescued from a warlord in Somalia, each person she'd touched, each life she'd saved, each crisis she'd averted, all of it had been buried under the facade of Eleanor Martinez, humble office worker. Meanwhile, her children continued their lives in blissful ignorance. Michael called that Tuesday to complain about his mother's weird mood at dinner, telling his wife how embarrassing it was that his mom had claimed to receive a presidential invitation. "She's getting delusional in her old age," he said, during a family video call that Sarah lives to her followers as content about dealing with aging parents. "We might need to look into assisted living soon." Yesterday she claimed she knew the ambassador to France personally. "It's honestly becoming pathetic." David chimed in from his corner of the screen. "Remember when she said she'd been to Prague? She's never left the state except for that time she visited Aunt Rita." The fantasy stories are getting out of hand. Their mocking laughter echoed through Eleanor's phone as she listened from the kitchen. Having called Sarah's number during the impromptu family roast session, they had no idea she was on the line, hearing every cruel word. That weekend, Eleanor attended a reception at the French embassy, hosted by the same ambassador David had mocked her for claiming to know. Ambassador Laurent Dubois embraced her like an old friend, which he was. "Mon Dieu, Eleanor, 20 years since Marseille, and you haven't aged a day. You must tell me how retirement treats you." She spent the evening switching effortlessly between French, Russian, and Arabic, discussing geopolitics with diplomats who respected her insights. These people knew her true worth, saw her for who she really was rather than dismissing her as an embarrassment. The transformation was remarkable. Eleanor had spent so many years hunched in shame, apologizing for her simple lifestyle, accepting her children's condescension as deserved. Now, surrounded by people who understood the magnitude of her service, she stood taller, spoke with authority, let her intelligence shine without apology. When former colleagues shared war stories, Eleanor found herself laughing genuinely for the first time in years. When they asked for her opinion on current international situations, she offered insights honed by decades of real-world experience. When they thanked her for her service, she accepted their gratitude with the dignity she'd forgotten she possessed. 3 weeks into her reawakening, the phone rang during her morning coffee. The caller ID showed only a Washington, D.C. number, but Eleanor recognized the significance immediately. "Mrs. Martinez, this is Rebecca Chen from the White House Social Office. I'm calling to confirm the details for your Presidential Medal of Freedom ceremony next month." The young woman's voice carried deep respect. "The president specifically requested that I ask, would you like your family present for the presentation? We can arrange seating for immediate family members." Eleanor smiled, thinking of her children's shocked faces when they discovered the truth. "Yes," she said quietly, "I'd like them there very much." Eleanor sat at her kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, her mind sharp as the day she'd planned her first covert operation. 30 years of strategic thinking hadn't dulled, if anything. This mission felt more personal and important than any she'd undertaken for her country. The Presidential Medal of Freedom ceremony was scheduled for 3 weeks away. She had that long to orchestrate the perfect revelation, to ensure maximum impact when her children discovered the truth about the woman they'd dismissed as nobody special. Her first call was to Rebecca Chen at the White House Social Office. "I'd like to request that media coverage be expanded for the ceremony," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the quiet authority she'd once used to coordinate international operations. "This story might resonate with families across America." The importance of recognizing unsung heroes. Rebecca's enthusiasm was immediate. "Mrs. Martinez, your story is exactly what the country needs to hear right now. I'll coordinate with the press office to ensure full coverage. CNN, Fox, MSNBC, they'll all want to be there." "Perfect." Eleanor made a note on her pad. Media secured. Next came the delicate task of ensuring her children's attendance without revealing the true nature of the event. She knew them well enough to understand their motivations, career advancement, social status, networking opportunities. They'd never come to honor their mother, but they'd crawl over glass to attend a high-profile White House event if they thought it could benefit them professionally. She called Michael first, her voice carefully modulated to sound uncertain and grateful. "Michael, sweetheart, I need your help with something. You know how you always said I should network more? Well, I've been invited to some sort of government ceremony in Washington, and I'm terrified to go alone." The invitation says I can bring family. What kind of ceremony, Mom? His tone was already impatient. Something about community service recognition. I think they invite ordinary citizens to make speeches look more relatable. I don't really understand it, but they're having it at the White House, and I thought maybe you could use it for networking. You always say politicians need good lawyers. Double quotes. The hook was set. She could hear his interest spike immediately. The White House. Mom, this could be huge for my career. I know several firms that would kill for those connections. Of course I'll come. Sarah was even easier. A White House event. Mother, do you realize what this could do for my brand? The content opportunities alone. I'll bring my photographer. This could be the boost I need to hit 3 million followers. David required the most finesse. Eleanor waited until she knew he'd be in his office, surrounded by colleagues who might overhear. David, I'm so sorry to bother you at work, but I've been invited to some Washington networking event, and the invitation says, and family. I know you're busy, but someone mentioned there might be tech executives there, and I thought of your new product launch. Hold on, Mom. You're saying you got invited to a White House networking event. How did that happen? Eleanor's smile was sharp as a blade. I honestly don't know. Maybe they're just trying to include regular people, but I thought it might be good for business connections. I'll clear my schedule. This is exactly the kind of exposure we need right now. Within 2 hours, all 3 children had not only committed to attending but had begun rearranging their lives around the event. Michael postponed a crucial deposition. Sarah canceled a lucrative sponsorship shoot. David moved a board meeting that had been planned for months. Eleanor watched their frantic activity with cold satisfaction. They were falling over themselves to attend an event they assumed would benefit their careers. Never suspecting they were walking into a reckoning 30 years in the making, she spent the next week coordinating with her former colleagues who would also be attending. Director Harrison would be there, along with Patricia Chen and Ambassador Dubois. Other operatives she'd worked with were flying in from around the world. The intelligence community was buzzing with excitement about finally seeing Eleanor Blackwood receive her due recognition. The final touch was reaching out to the families of people she'd saved over the years. Many of them had never known who their rescuer was, but classified files were being declassified for the ceremony. They would finally get to thank the woman who'd risked everything to bring their loved ones home. On the morning of the ceremony, Eleanor stood before her bedroom mirror for the final time as the woman her children thought they knew. She pinned her service ribbons to her simple black dress medals for valor, commendations for excellence, recognition from foreign governments she'd served in secret. Each pin was a reminder of who she really was, of the battles she'd fought and won while her children slept safely in their beds, never knowing the price of their security. Eleanor Martinez, embarrassing mother, was about to disappear forever. Agent Eleanor Blackwood was ready for the most important mission of her life. Michael's BMW rental gleamed in the morning sun as he adjusted his Hermes tie for the 3rd time outside Eleanor's modest home. Sarah emerged from her Uber wearing a designer outfit she'd carefully selected for maximum Instagram impact, her ring light already positioned for pre-event content creation. Followers, we are about to enter the White House, she announced to her phone camera, her voice dripping with manufactured excitement. Thanks to some amazing networking, your girl is about to rub shoulders with the most powerful people in America. David pulled up in his Tesla rental, immediately on a conference call with his marketing team. Yes, get the press release ready. Tech CEO David Martinez, spotted at exclusive White House event. I want this trending by tonight. Eleanor watched her children's theatrical preparations from her front window, their self-importance on full display. Not one of them had asked what the event was actually about. Too consumed with their own potential gains to show even cursory interest in their mother's role. Mom, come on, Michael called impatiently. We can't be late to something this important. My reputation is on the line here. Eleanor emerged in her simple black dress and modest heels, carrying only a small purse. Her children's eyes swept over her with barely concealed horror. Mother, please tell me you have something more appropriate to wear, Sarah hissed. We're going to be photographed with important people. You look like you're going to church in 1985. This is all I have. Sweetheart, Eleanor said quietly, knowing that in a few hours, this simple dress would be photographed alongside the President of the United States. David shook his head in frustration. Fine, whatever. Just try not to embarrass us. Okay, these are serious people with serious careers. Don't mention your little office job or try to make small talk about the weather. They loaded into Michael's rental car. automatically relegating Eleanor to the back seat like an unwelcome passenger. She sat quietly between their suit bags and Sarah's photography equipment, listening to them coach each other on name-dropping techniques and networking strategies. "Remember, confidence is key," Michael lectured as they drove through DC traffic. "Act like we belong there. Don't look starstruck or act impressed by anything. We're successful professionals who deserve to be in these circles." Sarah nodded enthusiastically while touching up her makeup. "I've researched everyone who might be there. Senators, cabinet members, Supreme Court justices. I need photos with at least 5 high-profile people for content this week." David turned around to face Eleanor, his tone condescending. "Just follow our lead, okay? Smile, nod. Don't offer opinions about politics or policy. Let us do the talking when we meet important people. You'll just blend into the background." Eleanor met his eyes in the rearview mirror with a calm she hadn't felt in years. "I understand perfectly, David." As they approached the White House complex, the children's excitement reached fever pitch. They babbled about photo opportunities, business cards to exchange, and connections to cultivate. Eleanor remained silent, watching the familiar landmarks of a city where she'd briefed presidents and shaped policy for 3 decades. The security checkpoint loomed ahead, and Eleanor could see her children rehearsing their explanations for how they'd gained access to such an exclusive event. They had no idea that half the security personnel recognized her face from classified briefings, that her clearance level had been higher than most senators, that she'd walked these halls as someone whose opinion could alter international relations. As they pulled through the White House gates, a distinguished man in a dark suit approached their car. Eleanor recognized him immediately: Colonel James Rodriguez, former military liaison she'd worked with on countless operations. His eyes widened in recognition and respect as he spotted Eleanor in the back seat. Without hesitation, Colonel Rodriguez snapped to attention and rendered a sharp military salute directly at Eleanor through the car window. Michael, Sarah, and David turned in confusion, looking around the car to see who could possibly deserve such military respect. Finding no one of importance, they exchanged bewildered glances. "That's weird," Sarah muttered. "Must have been for someone behind us." Eleanor simply nodded graciously at the colonel, accepting his tribute with the quiet dignity of someone who had earned it through blood, sacrifice, and service her children couldn't imagine. The irony was perfect. Sitting in the back seat like an embarrassment, she was already receiving more genuine respect than her children would garner in a lifetime of networking and social climbing. The East Room of the White House buzzed with dignified conversation as America's most distinguished citizens took their seats. Eleanor's children had positioned themselves prominently in the VIP section, their phones ready to capture every networking opportunity, completely unaware that the woman they'd dismissed as an embarrassment was about to become the center of national attention. Michael adjusted his tie nervously, scanning the room for potential clients among the assembled senators and cabinet members. Sarah live-streamed quietly to her followers, whispering about the incredible access her family connections had provided. David networked aggressively, pressing business cards into the hands of anyone who looked important. Eleanor sat quietly in the front row reserved for honorees, her hands folded in her lap with the same calm composure she'd maintained during hostage negotiations and covert operations. Around her sat other Presidential Medal of Freedom recipients, a Supreme Court justice, a Nobel Prize-winning scientist, a civil rights leader who'd changed history. She belonged among them, though her children would never have believed it. An hour ago, the Marine Band struck up "Hail to the Chief," and the room rose as one. President Harrison entered with the dignity befitting his office. But Eleanor noticed his eyes seeking hers across the crowded room. When their gazes met, he nodded with unmistakable respect, a gesture between equals who understood the weight of service. "Ladies and gentlemen," the president began, his voice carrying clearly through the ornate room. "Today we honor Americans who have embodied the very best of our nation's values. These individuals have served with distinction, often in ways the public never knew, sacrificing comfort and recognition for the greater good of their fellow citizens." Eleanor's children barely listened, too busy planning their social media posts and identifying potential connections in the audience. They had no idea that cameras were already focusing on their section, preparing to capture their reactions to what would unfold. "Our first honoree," the president continued, his tone growing more reverent, "represents the countless unsung heroes who serve our nation in shadows, whose sacrifices remain classified long after their service ends. For 30 years, this American worked in the most dangerous corners of the world, preventing catastrophes that would have claimed thousands of innocent lives. Michael glanced around, mildly interested in meeting this mysterious hero who might have useful government connections. In 1994, she single-handedly prevented a terrorist attack that would have killed 3,000 civilians in Prague. In 1998, she infiltrated an arms-dealing network that was selling weapons to enemy states. In 2001, she rescued 12 hostages from a compound in Afghanistan. While under heavy fire, Sarah's livestream suddenly felt inappropriate as the gravity of the president's words settled over the room. This wasn't the networking event she'd expected. In 2003, she prevented the theft of nuclear materials that could have armed terrorist organizations. In 2007, she exposed a human trafficking ring that had enslaved hundreds of children across Eastern Europe. David's business cards remained unshared in his pocket as he found himself genuinely listening to the litany of heroic acts. Throughout her distinguished career, she received the Bronze Star, the Distinguished Intelligence Cross, and commendations from 6 foreign governments for her extraordinary service to international peace and security. The president paused, allowing the magnitude of these achievements to resonate through the silent room. She accomplished all of this while raising 3 children as a single mother, never once allowing her dangerous work to overshadow her dedication to her family. Her children never knew that when she missed their school events for work conferences, she was actually preventing international crises. They never knew that their quiet, modest mother was one of the most decorated operatives in American intelligence history. Eleanor's children began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, a terrible recognition beginning to dawn. Today, we finally honor her publicly for service that has remained classified for decades. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in recognizing Agent Eleanor Blackwood, recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom. The room erupted in thunderous applause as Eleanor rose gracefully from her seat. Every person in that room, senators, generals, diplomats, stood in genuine admiration for the small woman in the simple black dress, who had served her country with unparalleled distinction. Eleanor walked toward the president with the same quiet confidence she'd carried through war zones and diplomatic crises. Behind her, she could feel the weight of her children's stunned silence, their world cracking apart as 30 years of assumptions crumbled in real time. As the president placed the medal around her neck, Eleanor finally allowed herself to stand tall, no longer hiding the strength and dignity that had always been hers by right. Agent Blackwood, the president said, his voice thick with emotion, on behalf of a grateful nation, thank you for your extraordinary service and sacrifice. The cameras captured every moment, the president's respectful salute, Eleanor's quiet dignity, and in the background, 3 successful adults sitting in shocked silence as they finally understood who their mother really was. The media explosion began before Eleanor had even left the White House. Within minutes of the ceremony's conclusion, #Eleanor Blackwood was trending worldwide on every social platform. The story had everything that captured public imagination: a secret hero, ungrateful children, and 30 years of hidden sacrifice, finally brought to light. CNN's Anderson Cooper led the evening news with Eleanor's story. Tonight, we bring you an extraordinary tale of service and sacrifice. Eleanor Blackwood, known to her family simply as Mom, has been revealed as one of America's most decorated intelligence operatives. But perhaps most shocking is how her own children treated the woman they never knew was a national hero. The footage was devastating. Side by side, networks played Eleanor's dignified acceptance speech next to cell phone video that had somehow surfaced of her children mocking her. Delusions of grandeur at recent family gatherings, the contrast was stark and damning. A genuine American hero being ridiculed by the very people she'd sacrificed everything to protect. Eleanor's phone rang incessantly with interview requests. 60 Minutes, Good Morning America, The Today Show, every major news program wanted to tell her story. She accepted selectively, choosing platforms that would allow her to speak with the dignity she'd been denied for so long. For 30 years, I lived 2 lives, she told Katie Couric in an exclusive sit-down interview. During the day, I was Eleanor Martinez, single mother trying to give her children the best life possible. But when duty called, I became Agent Blackwood, working to keep America safe. My children's security, both physical and emotional, always came first, even when it meant they could never know who I really was. The interviewer leaned forward, clearly moved. How did it feel when they called you nobody special? Eleanor's composed facade cracked slightly. It broke my heart, but I understood their perspective. They saw a woman who worked what appeared to be a mundane job, who couldn't afford the luxuries their friends' parents provided. They never knew I was selling family heirlooms to fund their education, or that my work trips involved preventing nuclear materials from reaching terrorist organizations. Meanwhile, her children's carefully constructed public personas were collapsing in real time. Sarah's Instagram exploded with furious comments as her followers discovered the truth about her family dynamic. Imagine calling your CIA operative mother embarrassing. Read one viral comment with 50,000 likes. This woman prevented terrorist attacks while you complained about her car being too old. The audacity is breathtaking. Sarah's follower count plummeted by 200,000. In the first day, as sponsors pulled out of deals, unwilling to associate their brands with someone who'd publicly humiliated a decorated war hero. Michael's law firm found itself fielding calls from outraged clients who'd seen news reports about their partner's treatment of his mother. The managing partners called an emergency meeting, concerned about the firm's reputation being tarnished by association. How do we explain to our military contractor clients that one of our partners publicly mocked a Medal of Freedom recipient? The senior partner asked pointedly, someone who risked her life to serve the same country our clients worked to defend. David's tech company stock dropped 12% in 2 days as investors questioned the leadership qualities of a CEO who'd shown such spectacular lack of judgment about his own family. Board members privately discussed whether someone with such poor character assessment belonged at the helm of a public company. The public's fascination with Eleanor's story seemed insatiable. Late-night talk show hosts built entire monologues around the irony of successful children being embarrassed by their hero mother. Social media influencers created content analyzing the family dynamics, with most expressing support for Eleanor and disgust at her children's behavior. This woman literally saved thousands of lives, Stephen Colbert said to thunderous applause, and her kids thought she was boring because she drove an old Honda. I can't even imagine the level of entitlement required to mock someone who prevented nuclear terrorism while you were complaining about your trust fund not being big enough. International media picked up the story, with foreign governments Eleanor had secretly assisted coming forward to praise her service. The French ambassador publicly thanked her for preventing an attack on the Louvre. The German chancellor mentioned her role in stopping a biological weapons plot. 6 different countries offered her their highest civilian honors. Through it all, Eleanor maintained her dignity, never directly attacking her children in interviews, but letting the facts speak for themselves. When asked if she felt vindicated, she simply said, I feel free. For the first time in 30 years, I can be proud of who I am without hiding behind a facade. The children's attempts to reach her became increasingly desperate. As the media storm intensified, Michael left 17 voicemails, his voice progressing from confused to panicked. Sarah posted tearful Instagram stories claiming misunderstanding, but they only generated more backlash. David hired a crisis management firm to help rehabilitate his image, but Eleanor's phone number had been changed. Her modest house sat empty, neighbors reporting they hadn't seen her in days. Eleanor Blackwood had vanished as completely as she once had during her most sensitive operations, leaving her children to face the consequences of a lifetime of cruelty toward a woman who deserved nothing but their gratitude and respect. The hero had finally stepped out of the shadows, but she was no longer accessible to those who had spent decades pushing her into them. 6 months after the White House ceremony, Eleanor's children finally tracked her down to a veterans retreat in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. The rustic lodge hosted annual gatherings for former intelligence operatives, a place where Eleanor had found the community and respect that had been missing from her life for decades. Michael spotted her first, sitting on the lodge's wraparound porch in quiet conversation with a group of decorated veterans. She looked different, not physically, but in the way she carried herself. Gone was the hunched posture of a woman accustomed to making herself smaller. Eleanor sat straight-backed, her voice confident as she shared a story that made her companions laugh with genuine warmth. Sarah hung back behind a pine tree, her once pristine social media presence now a fraction of its former glory. Sponsors had fled, followers had abandoned her, and the few brands still willing to work with her offered embarrassingly small contracts. The woman who'd built her identity on influence and admiration now faced daily criticism from people who'd seen her true character exposed. David looked haggard, the stress of the past months evident in his drawn face. His company's board had voted him out as CEO, citing irreparable damage to corporate reputation. The man who'd dismissed his mother as nobody special now found himself genuinely nobody special in the business world he'd once dominated. Eleanor noticed them approaching before they reached the porch steps. She excused herself from her companions with the easy grace of someone comfortable in her own skin, and descended to meet her children on neutral ground. "Hello, Michael, Sarah, David." Her voice was calm, devoid of the desperate eagerness to please that had once characterized her interactions with them. "Mom," Michael began, but Eleanor raised a gentle hand. "I go by Eleanor now. My colleagues here know me by my service, not by relationships that were built on deception." The words hit like physical blows. Sarah's carefully rehearsed apology died in her throat. These people respected their mother in ways they'd never bothered to attempt. "We've been looking for you everywhere," David said, his voice cracking. "We need to explain." "What would you like to explain?" Eleanor's tone remained steady. "That you spent 30 years mocking a woman who sold her mother's jewelry to pay for your educations. That you called someone who prevented terrorist attacks embarrassing. That you dismissed as fantasy the very real sacrifices I made to keep you safe." Michael stepped forward desperately. "We didn't know. How could we have known if you never told us?" Eleanor studied her eldest son with the same analytical gaze she'd once used to assess foreign threats. "You never asked, Michael. In 42 years, not one of you ever asked about my past, my dreams, or my experiences beyond how they served your immediate needs. When I tried to share exciting news at dinner, you cut me off without listening. When I mentioned traveling to Prague or knowing diplomats, you dismissed it as the ramblings of a delusional old woman. But we're sorry now," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We know we were wrong. Can't we start over? Sorry because you finally understand who I am, or sorry because the world now sees who you are." Eleanor's question hung in the mountain air like morning mist. "I've watched the news coverage, read the social media posts. Your apologies came only after your reputations were damaged, not when you realized you'd hurt someone who loved you unconditionally." David fell to his knees, the proud tech executive reduced to a broken man begging his mother's forgiveness. "Please, we've lost everything. Our careers, our reputations, our respect. We need you." Eleanor looked down at her youngest child with infinite sadness. "Now you understand what I lived with for 30 years, being dismissed. Having no respect, losing pieces of myself to give you everything you needed. The difference is, I chose that sacrifice out of love. You're experiencing consequences of choices made from selfishness. So you won't forgive us." Michael's voice was hollow with defeat. "Forgiveness isn't something you can demand or earn through suffering," Eleanor replied. "It's something freely given by someone who chooses grace over justice. But reconciliation that requires more than apologies. It requires genuine change, demonstrated over time, by people who understand the value of what they destroyed." She looked at each of her children, seeing not successful adults but broken people finally confronting the consequences of their cruelty. "You want to know what love looks like? It looks like 30 years of silent sacrifice. You want to know what honor means? It means serving others, even when they can't appreciate or acknowledge that service. You want to know what forgiveness requires? It requires becoming people worthy of the love you rejected." Eleanor's words settled over her children like a judgment they couldn't appeal. A truth they could no longer deny or dismiss. They had spent decades taking for granted the love of someone extraordinary, and now they had to discover whether they possessed the character necessary to earn back what they had so carelessly thrown away. 2 years after the White House ceremony, Eleanor stood before a packed auditorium at the National Defense University, delivering the keynote address to graduating intelligence officers. The woman who had once apologized for her existence now commanded rooms filled with America's future defenders. "Service," she told the eager young faces before her, "is not about recognition or reward. It's about the choice you make every day to put something greater than yourself first. Some of you will spend decades in shadows, protecting people who will never know your names. That is not a burden, that is an honor." The thunderous applause that followed felt like vindication for every year she'd spent hiding her light under the bushel of false modesty her children had demanded. Eleanor's new life bore no resemblance to the quiet desperation of her former existence. She served on the board of 3 veteran organizations, consulted for the State Department on international security matters, and had been appointed as a special advisor on intelligence reform. Publishers competed for her memoir rights, documentary filmmakers sought her story, universities offered her honorary degrees. Most importantly, she was surrounded by people who saw her true worth. Colonel Rodriguez had become a close friend. often joining her for morning walks around her new home in a Virginia suburb populated by retired military officers. Ambassador Dubois visited monthly, bringing wine and stories from diplomatic circles that still spoke her name with reverence. "You seem genuinely happy," Patricia Chen observed one evening as they shared dinner at Eleanor's comfortable new home. "I don't think I've ever seen you this at peace." Eleanor smiled, looking around her living room decorated with awards and photos from her real-life images of her with presidents and prime ministers, commendations from grateful nations, pictures with fellow operatives who'd become lifelong friends. "I spent so many years trying to be small enough to fit into their idea of who I should be," Eleanor reflected. "I forgot that I was someone worth knowing before I became their mother." Her children had begun their own journeys of genuine change, though progress was slow and painful. Michael had left his high-powered law firm to work for Veteran Legal Aid, taking a 70% pay cut to help former service members navigate disability claims. He called once a month now, never demanding forgiveness but quietly demonstrating through his actions that he finally understood what service meant. Sarah had abandoned social media influencing entirely, instead volunteering at a nonprofit that supported military families. Her Instagram account now featured no selfies, only stories of veterans she'd helped, and resources for families in need. She wrote Eleanor letters, sexual handwritten letters, sharing what she was learning about sacrifice and humility. David had used his remaining wealth to establish a scholarship fund for children of fallen intelligence operatives. He'd taken a teaching position at a community college, working with students who reminded him of his mother's humble beginnings. His quarterly updates to Eleanor focused not on his achievements but on how his students were succeeding. Eleanor read their letters and listened to their calls with cautious hope. Redemption was possible, but it required the kind of sustained commitment they'd never shown before. They were learning, perhaps for the first time, that love was not a right but a gift that must be cherished and protected. Standing in her study one evening, Eleanor examined the Presidential Medal of Freedom displayed prominently on her wall. Next to it hung a simple photograph from her childhood, herself at 8 years old, already displaying the quiet determination that would define her life. That little girl had dreamed of serving something greater than herself. She had achieved that dream in ways beyond her wildest imagination, even if recognition had come decades later than deserved. Eleanor had learned the most powerful lesson of all. Sometimes, the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemies. It's refusing to let their blindness dim your light any longer. True nobility had nothing to do with wealth, status, or social media followers. It lived in the quiet heroism of those who served others without seeking recognition, who sacrificed without keeping score, who protected the innocent while asking for nothing in return. Eleanor Blackwood had spent 30 years being somebody extraordinary while pretending to be nobody special. She would never hide her truth again.